Hello and welcome to the Scholar Progenium. Today we're going to be doing a bolt action tactics video where we look at the Churchill AVRE. Now this is an absolutely superb vehicle. It's extremely fun to use, it's well costed and very viable to get into a list, and it's very powerful, let's face it. Now it's got some interesting history and lore behind it, which it does play into, and that also interacts very interestingly with a couple of rules in the bolt action rulebook that you need to be aware of just to get the most juice out of this unit. Now we'll go into all of that over the course of this video, so let's find out more. So what is the Churchill AVRE? Now essentially in 1942 there was a failed raid on a port in Germany called the Dieppe raid, and a lot of Canadians got absolutely hammered in that. It was an awful failed attack, and one of the issues that they had amongst many was the fact that the engineers could not penetrate the barricades. They were getting targeted by snipers, machine guns, mortars, all of this, and so the heavy armour couldn't get onto the beaches. They were taking heavy losses, and all in all it was a failed attack and a failed operation. Now a lieutenant by the name of J.J. Donovan, he essentially came up with the idea of, right, instead of getting our engineers up to their target locations to try and pull off their objectives and getting them killed, what we need to do is we need to build a tank that has side hatches, and you can see those side hatches here. That made this, and I believe, I'm not sure if it was the Cromwell, but there was another tank as well that was proposed, where essentially they could drive up, say there was some barricades, some blockades here, and they could just hop out of the vehicle, set up whatever they need to, drive back and detonate. And there was actually an extra crew member. It had 6 crew members because there was a demolition NCO as part of the crew whose job it was to do the engineer bit of the mission. Now, of course, that also is more famous for what it was known as the flying dustbin. It was a meme in its own time, OG 1942 memes with this bad boy. And it had the flying dustbin, which was a petard mortar, essentially fired a mortar. I think it was like 80 to 200 yards. And it was just a big old explosion, massive. I think it was like 60 odd kilograms of explosives, something like that. So really, really powerful, and it was literally for demolitions. This isn't for fighting in a battle. I mean, it is for fighting in a battle under heavy fire. That's why it's so heavily armoured, and it would be used on the front lines in engagement. So, and there was about 700 of them built. They started testing it in 1942, or they built a prototype in 1942, tested it in 1943, and it was on the battlefield by early 1944. So very justifiable to use in your games from a historical level. I know we like to hinder ourselves in bolt action and not use, or not just spam rare and unusual units, but this guy, he would have been on the front lines, he would have been fighting, and he was absolutely essential. Now, although it was a demolition vehicle designed for blowing up buildings and stuff like that, and we'll look into more of that later, it obviously can engage ground targets, defensive targets, and so on and so forth. And we'll be looking at how we do that in our rules now. Now, the Churchill AVRE is an Armour 10 vehicle with a heavy howitzer on the front that comes in at 290 points. It also has a medium machine gun on the front, but it gets a bit more interesting than that because the mortar can only be fired at short range. Now that has an advantage and a disadvantage. Obviously it means you only have a 36-inch range with it because it counts as a heavy howitzer, but it also means you'll only ever be suffering the penalties for moving and for the cover that your opponent's unit is in. Now, I see this personally as an advantage. You've got that heavy armour and you're not going to sit back and worry about it getting destroyed. You're going to need to get in and get aggressive with this vehicle. But remember, when your opponent, from their perspective, it's going to be very, very scary having this thing bearing down on them. It doesn't cause tiger fear, but it certainly causes an equivalent of that in your opponent. Now, it makes buildings just as essentially unusable. But if your opponent does decide to dig into a building, or let's say you're playing a mission where there is a objective or something like that that they want to hold that isn't a building, it makes it very, very dangerous to hold. And one of the reasons for that is a rule that is little used because it doesn't come up very much, but is very very interesting when you point it out to your opponents, which is that when you're shooting at buildings with HE, now we all know that you just shoot at the unit without the benefit of cover because you're shooting at the building itself, and then it gets a number of dice, in this case 3d6, which is absolutely ridiculous on the unit that you're shooting at. But also, in addition, if a weapon with HE value of 2d6 or greater hits a unit inside a building, the explosion might bring the entire house down about their heads. In this case, roll to determine how many hits are inflicted as usual, so that's just your normal 3d6 on the unit itself. It's not a separate roll. And if the total number of hits scored before halving if the unit goes down, so it doesn't matter about if they go down, this fully affects the building can't go down, you count the whole result, is 10 or more, then the building is blown to rubble and all infantry and artillery units inside it are destroyed. You remove the building and replace it with a ruinous equivalent or an area of rubble and debris. Now, basically, that's insane. Now, it doesn't come up very often because you don't often have units with a HE potential to actually bring down a building. 2d6, you're going to have to be very lucky on that. 1d6 obviously can't do it. But 3d6, the average is actually 10. So this thing can just blow up buildings. Just a demolition tank, that's what it does. So it's very, very interesting because, and I really like that as well because, and I'm not trying to like justify cheese by saying, oh, it totally fits in with the lore, but this is a demolition tank. It was designed with operations of destroying, buildings and tank traps and stuff like that. And so, it can and will do that in your games of bolt action, which I think is absolutely brilliant. Now, a couple of other things to be aware of. You cannot fire it indirect. So sometimes when you're firing with a fixed artillery piece, like a howitzer, you might think to yourself, oh, right, well, that unit's in hard cover, it's over half range, so I'm going to be hitting on a 6 either way. I may as well roll a, indirect fire, get a 6 this turn, and then at least I'm on a 5 next turn and my odds get better. But you can't actually do that with this vehicle. It has to shoot direct. I mean, it's shooting indirect because it's lobbing a shot, but it just always counts as direct. That's just the way it works. So you've no indirect fire option, but you do get the ability to roll right up into an opponent's face and pop them with a 4-inch template, pop them with 3d6 if they get into a building and possibly bring that building down and just level it, which is very, very, very interesting. Now, at 290 points, as I mentioned, but I'll just mention it again, you're really not having to compromise on your list too much. You can still fit in more HE options. You can get a medium howitzer or a light howitzer in your list, like a 25 pounder. I often take this paired with a 17 pounder, so I've got a 3-inch blast from my super heavy anti-tank gun and a 4-inch blast from this. And that pairing, and you can still fit plenty of veterans with LMGs in your list and have like a 10 dice list. That just absolutely, if I want to pull out the cheese and really kick some butt if I'm going to a tournament, then this guy is a serious consideration every time. And I mean, just look at him as well. He looks great. He's got the classic Churchill look, which is great. He's got that. I mean, even with my rubbish paint job, that big old chunky boy mortar on the front, it's just a sight to behold. And when you line it up against your opponent, it's one of those lists. It's like facing an 88 flak or a Nebelwerfer. It just certainly strikes fear into your opponents. Now, you don't want to be going, in terms of a couple of tactics, just very briefly, you don't want to be too brazen with him. If you can take the opportunity to get some cover, do it. But otherwise, you need to be moving this guy around, getting those shots off, and trying to take a position that is, it's worth moving and shooting a couple of times, or even just belting it up and running if you don't think you're going to get any decent shots off, and just getting him into a position where he then doesn't have to move, and you as long as he's got light cover and a really good range of options where he's going to really be suppressing your opponent, then you can just fire away all game, just on just accounting for cover. And if it just makes basically all light cover unusable for your opponent, because once he's in a good position, he's hitting units in light cover on a 4-up, which is, it's not, no one in bolt action is going to want to get a coin and be like, oh yeah, I'll just flip a coin on whether I get hit with a heavy howitzer shot for a 4-inch template. He's just going to wipe units out. So it makes a large portion of the board very unusable if you can get it up to just your side, just short of the mid board, and just reap havoc. And he's got, he can drive over stuff, he can drive around stuff, he can get himself into position, he can reposition, and with pen +4, and because it's HE, it never suffers a negative for being over half range, and he can't fire at half range anyway. That is a light anti-tank gun, so he can actually compete up to the same level as having a light anti-tank gun in terms of the tank duel, but he gets the benefit of D6 pins on a tank. So if a tank tries to mess with him, he's just going to pop it, and if he gets a hit, at the minimum, the pins will probably do a good job of knocking it out of the game for a turn. And he's very realistically, he can duel against light and medium tanks, but without too much trouble. It's not something people want to get involved in. So, all in all, just so well rounded. You can duel other vehicles, you can pop light vehicles, no problem whatsoever. Not even just pin them out, but just straight up destroy them. You can level buildings, you can level basically any infantry unit. That template's going to cover them, however big they are, unless it's like a crazy unit. So all in all, just an absolutely brilliant vehicle. Now, where can you find this fantastic beast? Well, it comes in the British and Canadian starter army. So nothing to see here, officer. Just a normal bolt action starter army. Nothing suspicious at all. However, in that you will get the Churchill with basically all the turret options. So, you've got a variety here of other weapons. And, you won't need those, obviously. I've not even painted mine up, because I just use the AVRE all the time because I'm a cheesy bastard. But no, joking aside, you can use it in other theatres and that kind of thing. But it is very, very cool. Now, obviously, you can buy it separately as well. But it's just nice to know that if you want to get into Brits and you want a decent chunk of infantry and a few decent options, then you can buy the starter army, and you will also get this absolute beast, which means you can start winning battles basically straight away, which is nice to know. So, yeah, that's basically it. A couple of tips and tricks there. Obviously, just remember, you want to get into that decent firing position where you're hitting on 4s if they're in light cover, 5s if they're in heavy cover. But apart from that, you don't want to be moving. You're not shooting at long range. So, just set up your bunker on a decent chunk of the battlefield. Deny your opponent the ability to enter that area. Make so that light cover is just basically unusable. Buildings unusable. The few walls, heavy cover that they can scrabble behind will be heavily occupied, and you can dump whole templates on those. So, just cause chaos, get stuck in, boys. Definitely get yourself a Churchill AVRE today. But yeah, so I hope you've enjoyed this. This has been the Scholar Progenium. I hope you found it interesting and entertaining, and hopefully a little bit useful too. And I'll be making more of these videos, so I'll catch you next time. Thanks very much for your time, and goodbye.